Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our webinar on requesting religious accommodations. My name is Ahmad Maaty, Board Chair of Muslim Americans in Public Service, a national nonprofit member organization that aims to build and formalize community, promote institutional representation, and facilitate the professional development of Muslim American public servants. If you're not already a member, I urge you to join today for free at mapsnational.org to do your part to share your talents or learn from others in our amazing growing national community. We'd like to thank our co-sponsor, Muslim Legal Fund of America, for their support and partnership for years now. Our program will begin with a facilitated discussion on the topic of workplace religious accommodation between our host, Ejaz Baluch, and MLFA's Chelsea Glover and Jinan Chehade, followed by some questions and answers from our attendees if time permits. Our moderator this evening, Ejaz Baluch, serves as chair of MAPS's Legal Advocacy Committee and is an attorney with the Public Justice Center's Workplace Justice Project, which promotes justice and equity in the workplace through litigation to combat wage theft and other workplace violations, knowing rights education for low-wage workers, and policy advocacy to expand their rights. Before joining the Public Justice Center in 2025, Ejaz was a trial attorney with the Employment Litigation Section of the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. He primarily represented the United States in federal district court in cases under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These cases typically included allegations of employment discrimination based on sex, race, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity by the state and local government employers, including police departments, fire departments, and school districts. Prior to joining the department, Ejaz was the 2018 to 2019 Francis D. Moynihan Jr. Appellate Advocacy Fellow at the Public Justice Center, where he appeared as lead counsel before state and federal appellate courts litigating cases that impacted development of civil rights and poverty law. Ejaz, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Ahmad. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. We are really excited for you to join this webinar today on requesting religious accommodations in the workplace and other workplace rights. We're joined by two great attorneys, civil litigation attorneys with the Muslim Legal Fund of America. First, Chelsea Glover, and as well as Jinan Chehade. Chelsea Glover is a senior staff attorney in the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in the American Civil Litigation Division. She began her legal career in 2015 and brings extensive experience in commercial litigation with a focus on antitrust and employment law. She has also represented clients pro bono in immigration appeals and humanitarian petitions, appearing in both state and federal courts. She's authored articles for the Texas Law Book and SMU Annual Texas Survey, and she is active in the J. Alternative Legal Association and the Dallas Women Lawyers Association. She was recognized as a Best Lawyers One to Watch honoree in antitrust litigation in 2022 and 2023. Before attending Duke University School of Law, where she earned a JD and an LLM, she taught developmental writing at Nashville State Community College and is licensed to practice in Texas. Thank you so much for joining us, Chelsea. And we are also joined by Jinan. She is a 2023 graduate of Georgetown University Law Center with experience in civil litigation, civil rights, and advocacy. During law school, she worked at the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division's Special Litigation Section, contributed to cases at the ACLU and CARE, and successfully represented an asylum seeker through Georgetown's Center for Applied Legal Studies. She's also a committed student leader, serving as president of Georgetown's Muslim Law Students Association and program chair for the National Muslim Law Students Association. Before law school, she studied public policy, Arabic, and Islamic world studies at DePaul University. Born and raised in Chicagoland, Jinan brings more than 8 years of community organizing experience and even founded a national nonprofit campaign that raised over $1 million for humanitarian causes worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us, Jinan. Okay, so today's webinar, we're going to go through a lot of topics. We have a jam-packed webinar today. We're going to talk about MLFA, more generally. There's the litigation team. We got a couple poll questions to try to learn who's in the audience tonight, which will better inform the information we're going to present to you all. And then we're going to talk specifically about Ramadan accommodations, with Ramadan just around the corner. We're also going to talk about religious accommodations more generally. and give you all tips on how to request these accommodations. And all that information is going to be pretty general. You don't necessarily need to be a public servant. You don't necessarily need to be a federal employee. These are all rights that everyone has by virtue of being an employee in the workplace. And then we're going to talk more specifically about OPM guidance, Office of Personnel Management's guidance that came out last summer for federal workers.
Enough, go.
And we're going to talk more specifically about that information for our federal workers in the audience. And then we're going to talk about how to request a religious accommodation based on that guidance from OPM. But again, the information we share about requesting that accommodation, that could also work in other workplaces as well, not necessarily federal workers. And then at the end, if we have time, we're going to go into the basics into religious discrimination as well as retaliation, and then have a Q&A portion. And so for the Q&A, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat during the course of the presentation. We'll be monitoring the chat for questions. If you're in the audience and you see another question that you are also wondering the answer to, feel free to give that question a like so that we know that multiple people in the audience want an answer to that question. And then at the end for the Q&A, which is we estimate will be the last 15 minutes of today's webinar, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. And with that, let's get started. And here we go. And I'll turn it now over to our great MLFA partners, Chelsea and Jinan.
Hello, thank you so much for having us. And we're so happy to present with MAPS. So I'll introduce you to our civil litigation team. As you can see, our pictures are on the screen. There's myself and Jinan Chehade, who is co-moderating with us. There's Samir El-Hossery and Ali Boyd and Rana Hakim. MLFA civil litigation team, we represent American Muslim organizations and individuals in federal court to protect their rights from discrimination, from harassment, and increasingly from state legislatures and governments and federal governments trying to take them out of existence, in other words. But our work, we also do federal agency action. We represent employees of federal and state governments, and we carry cases from the administrative level all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Again, my name is Jinan. Very nice to meet all of you, and it's great to be here. Thank you again, MAPS. I think just to add to that, our goal really here today is not only to empower each of you guys to seek religious accommodation, especially with Ramadan coming up, but really to understand the legal arena so you can confidently be able to request it and give you the practical tools of like how do you go about seeking religious accommodation. And as we know, especially now, given the political climate, it's more important now more than ever that we know our rights and we're confident in our ability to navigate religious accommodation, even in the workplace, because it can be a little intimidating, but hopefully by the end of this, you can feel empowered and know that this is not only your right, but this is a duty upon your employers as well. So excited to get started.
Okay, so we're going to touch on general religious accommodations. We're going to start with Ramadan accommodations because they're coming up, and then we'll talk about religious accommodations more generally.
Pretty cool. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to ask a couple poll questions now just for us to learn who's in the audience tonight, and so that we can tailor our information accordingly. So first poll question, let me pull it up here. Here we go. First, are you a lawyer or lawyer in training? And second, which best describes you? Federal employee, federal contractor, state government employee, county government employee, city or municipal government employee, other public sector, public school, university, or private sector. And I'll give you all, let's give you all about a minute or so to answer that. just answer the first two questions. The other two we'll talk about later in the presentation. Okay, so first we got about, it looks like about 20% or so of the folks in the audience are attorneys. The rest are not, or 60% said no, 20% said other public servant. And then it looks like about 70% of you all are federal employees, though we do have a couple people on the city municipal side, other public sector, a couple private sector folks, and then a few federal contractors and state government employees. All right, thank you very much. This is really helpful so that we can tailor the information for tonight's webinar. Great. So now with that, let's get to the actual accommodations and what the law says.
Okay, so under Title VII, employers are required to accommodate employees' religious practices. If they're covered under Title VII, all federal employees are covered by Title VII, all state employees are covered by Title VII. There's certain minimum employee requirements if you're in the private sector. I believe it has to be 15 or more employees. But if you're covered by Title VII, then an employer must reasonably accommodate your religious practices unless doing so creates a substantial burden. And this standard was recently clarified in a Supreme Court case from 2023, which was not that long ago, so it's still relatively recent. The previous standard said that an employer could refuse to accommodate if it created more than a de minimis burden, which many employers took to mean any financial impediment whatsoever. And the Supreme Court clarified that actually an employer must show that there is a substantial burden on their business in order to deny religious accommodation. So even if a single employee, say, cannot work on a specific day, unless an employer can show that that creates a substantial burden to the entire business, not just the office where that employee is, the employer must find a way to reasonably accommodate that practice. And whether an accommodation is reasonable will depend on the needs of the employer, the workforce, and other different factors. However, one thing it doesn't include is how other coworkers feel about your religion or your religious practices. That the employer cannot say that other employees don't like the fact that you participate in this particular religion or need extra time off. That is not a burden on the business. So some of the most commonly granted Ramadan accommodations for Ramadan are flexible scheduling. You can choose to start your workday earlier in the day, closer to suhoor, or you can start your workday a bit later, closer to iftar, to allow you, enough energy to do the work that you need. You could have a break in the middle of the day if feasible. For prayers times throughout the day, an employer should be able to find a reasonable prayer space for you that's clean. That can be your office, it could be a conference room, but they can't, just tell you to go into a hallway or into a janitor's closet. That wouldn't be reasonable. It has to be a clean and private space for prayer. Employers can also allow meal breaks for you to break your fast and to accommodate your dietary needs. One other thing that's not specifically laid out here is, not requiring you to participate in mandatory lunch events, or if you're going to have mandatory meetings, not centering them around food, to be respectful to people who are fasting versus not. And workload adjustments. If you have a more labor-intensive job, you can ask for some reduction of that intensity for this period to accommodate the fact that you are fasting. Flexible deadlines as well. If there's something that maybe needs to be done, or you have a deadline during Ramadan where you probably just need extra time, an employer should be able to reasonably accommodate that.
All right, so I'm gonna hop in here. So this is just the general religious accommodations kind of layout of everything. So how do you navigate, how do you understand the legal arena in this area? As we know, employers must reasonably accommodate employees' religious practices. This is like really important. When I was saying like employers do have a duty, they really do have a duty according to Title VII to accommodate employees' religious practices. So I remember like speaking to my friend and she was saying like, oh, I don't know if my employer is going to give me Jummah off, like if they're nice enough to, things like that. But just remember that this is not something out of the kindness of their heart or that they can like choose to mull over, but this is really a duty upon employers to accommodate your religious needs. So hopefully you have that in the back of your mind to like give you confidence when requesting it. But there is a limit to this. So as long as it does not substantially burden, I think the substantial burden part, you want to keep those words in mind. There's a very intentional reason, obviously, that it says substantial burden, not just burden. It's a very high bar. As we know, this country itself was built on the principles of freedom of religion and these kinds of principles in the Constitution. So it really is a high bar. So again, they have to accommodate your religious accommodation, except if it's a substantial burden to them. So minimal cost does not create substantial burden if they say, oh, like we're just we can't move this meeting because I just can't, like just general increase, things like that. It has to meet this high threshold. Employees must communicate what they need, but there's no magic words. So I know we're used to like the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment to say like the magic words of the right to remain silent and things like that, but there's actually no magic words here. You just you request the accommodation that you need. Employers and employees must interact to find accommodations. So let's say that it imposes somewhat of a burden, a substantial burden, but they have a duty to kind of work with you to minimize that burden, also meet you where you're at. So kind of that kind of compromise. So let's say that you can't leave work early, but is there a way for you to come earlier or work out the timings that way? If there's a specific deadline, can you get started on it beforehand? And so it's ready by the time, Ramadan comes around, things like that. So working with you in that way is really important. So if it's an outright denial, employers do have a duty to kind of work and compromise with you on that. And then employers who deny a request must prove why it counts as a substantial burden and still must suggest something else rather than just say no. So again, this is really important. They can't just say no outright, books closed, move on. They have to give a specific reason of why it's a substantial burden on the workplace, things like that. And if it is, to find a possible alternative. And we'll get to like what that looks like if they say no and they deny, of how do you go about those steps and what you should look out for. But that's kind of like the framework that we're looking at here. Again, they have a duty. The limit is a substantial burden. Even if it is a substantial burden, how can you give alternatives as well? All right, so this is kind of very similar to what Chelsea went over, but I'll go over similarly. What Chelsea went over was Ramadan accommodations. This is common accommodations for Muslims. Flexible scheduling. So a schedule or shift change that allows for prayer breaks is really important. Prayer space, again, it can't be just like a gender's closet or anything like that. A real prayer space where you can, focus, that's clean and everything. Religious clothing, allowing women and men to wear religious headwear, whether that be like a kufi for men or obviously a hijab for women. Beards, allowing men to maintain their religious beards. And then food, providing halal or vegetarian food options. So not ordering, pork with pepperoni on it or pizza with pepperoni on it every lunch, but really having alternatives as well. So those are kind of the things that you can keep in mind when you're requesting religious accommodation.
Okay, so we're going to go over some of the tips for employees. First one is check your handbook. Follow the established policies that your employer gives you. Typically, they will lay out what their religious accommodation policy is, who you need to make the request to, and how you need to make that request. Following those procedures will protect you in the long run if there is a dispute, because you can go back to the handbook and say, here's the steps that I followed, and the employer did not respond in the way that is required by law. So first step, check what the protocol is that's given by the employer.
Yes. Do communicate. So this is really important that we have to do anyway, but provide your employer with enough information and just enough time in general to understand your accommodation why you need it and why it's important to your beliefs, and to plan ahead. So not same day I need, to telework for the next month, but just having that conversation with them, giving them time to understand, time to prepare, and adjust scheduling to meet that accommodation as well.
And do recognize the limits. Remember, we said it has to be a reasonable accommodation. And so to use the Ramadan example, you can't go to your employer the day before Ramadan and say, I need to take the whole next month off. And I just got started last week. I have no PTO, but this is my religious practice. That will probably create a substantial burden on the employer. The employer is not required to accommodate that request because they could say that's not reasonable. You are then supposed to tailor that request in line of the needs of the employer and also like your workability, but just make sure that you don't expect the employer to grant your exact request every single time. Sometimes they may decide it's not reasonable.
Yes, and finally, don't violate policy, obviously. Just be familiar with your company's policy. What does it look like? And if you do have to violate policy, make sure you're having a conversation with management of why you can't meet that policy because of religious reasons. Is there a way to change that policy? So just be familiar with these things before going into that conversation.
Okay, so just a reminder to everyone, if you have if any questions come up, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll try to get to them during the Q&A portion of tonight's webinar. So thanks so much, Chelsea and Jinan, for laying all that out for us. And like I said earlier, the information they just gave is applicable to any workplace. These are accommodations. It doesn't matter, public sector, private sector, what kind of agency you're at. This is generally applicable. All of that was generally applicable information that applies to any person seeking a religious accommodation in the workplace. But now I'm going to transition us a little bit from that general information to more specific information that applies to federal workers. We know that about 80% of you attending tonight are federal workers. And so we're going to talk about now the July 16th, 2025 guidance that the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, put out. And actually, we're going to link in the chat a copy of the memo that I'm going to start describing now. So this is guidance that OPM issued to federal agencies last summer. And basically, OPM says that agencies are encouraged to take a generous approach to approving religious accommodations in general. And they listed some specific accommodations that agencies should consider, including telework, religious compensatory time off, comp time off, flexible work schedules, including Maxiflex work schedules, credit hours earned under flexible work schedules, advanced annual leave, and earned comp time off for overtime work and comp time off for travel. These are all examples in the memo of different kinds of accommodations agencies can approve. And the guidance also said that agencies are strongly encouraged to consider telework specifically as a reasonable accommodation for religious practices. The memo also specifically mentions fasting and scheduled prayers and services as examples of times when it would be appropriate to approve telework as a religious accommodation. And I know there's like some marking on the slide. I'm not sure why it's there, so I apologize for that. And OPM instructed agencies that denial of telework accommodations for religious practices or observances must be justified with evidence of significant operational impact on the agency, similar to what was said earlier, based on recent Supreme Court precedent. And I want to excerpt here, this is straight from the memo itself. This is the section on telework as a religious accommodation. And so you see here, agencies are strongly encouraged when feasible to consider telework. And, they talk about scheduled prayers, services, fasting, and other religious accommodations. And then, even here on the second bullet, fasting is mentioned again, as well as prayer and religious observances. This could obviously be applied to Juma prayer on Friday, telework to provide flexibility, to engage in time-specific religious practices during breaks in the workday. And then fasting, telework can be an accommodation for employees who wish to take breaks in the workday to engage in fasting-related practices, such as prayer or rest, in a quieter or more private setting. And and this bottom paragraph here talks about basically how great telework is. It's a low-cost solution that aligns with the Groff standard, which is the recent Supreme Court case mentioned earlier. And so my point in highlighting this guidance is to show all of you that this is what the federal government is saying. This is what OPM is instructing agencies to do, and so you should feel confident and empowered to try to take advantage of these accommodations. I know there's been some debate of like, well, is this loosening the standard, or is this sort of reiterating the current standard that always existed? To me, it's a distinction without a difference. At the end of the day, this is the guidance being put out, and we should all feel empowered to take advantage of it. So how should we go about requesting this sort of thing? So luckily, MAPS put together, we drafted a template. I helped draft it along with Ahmad and some other folks when the OPM guidance came out, and we're going to link that template in the chat. Link to that template in the chat so that you can all view it and download it. And I believe soon it will be available on our website, on MAPS's website. But basically, the template, it's a template. We in the government, we love a template, right? So you just take the language, and you can adjust it to your specific situation. There's language in there for Juma. There's language in there for Ramadan. And so now I want to bring back in Chelsea and Jinan here. So suppose I'm a federal worker. I'm in MAPS. I have access to this template. I want to telework. Let's say I want to submit a request to telework for the month of Ramadan. I'm a little nervous because it's a whole month, but I want to give it a shot. And so Chelsea and Jinan, can you help walk me through, if I'm a federal worker and I want to make this request, what should I do? So I'm going to take the template. I'm going to, change the language to my specific agency's situation and policies. And then what do I do next?
Next step is to submit that request to either your supervisor or to HR. That's where I would refer to the employer handbook or the manual who you submit your request for religious accommodations to get that interactive process started. So once you make that request, then you should hear back from the point person as to why that request is granted or denied. So if you request, say you want to telework the entire month of Ramadan, they may come back and say, this is great. Of course, cite to any policy that supports your argument, which is covered in the MAPS template. And some employers may agree with that. Some may push back and say, well, that's a pretty long time. That may be unreasonable for the entire month. What about, now they should also compromise and offer a different suggestion. What about teleworking for certain hours of the day? Ramadan is a great case study because the times, the start and end times of fasting change throughout the period. So you may not have the same need to telework at the same time each day of Ramadan, but you can go over that with the person you're speaking to with that interactive process. So they say you receive pushback that they don't agree with you teleworking for the whole month. You can, if they first say no, then follow up and offer a different solution, because that just, for the future, if they continue to say no, you can say, I've done my part. I've been participating in the interactive process and they haven't. Sometimes employers really just do need help. They don't understand necessarily why certain broader management structure. And so you may want to suggest telework for specific time periods, or you may want to, I'm sorry if I'm breaking up a bit. You may necessary something that can work for both you and the employer.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is really
But
helpful.
that's
Thank you.
how that process would go. You would just
sorry if I cut you off.
oh, I didn't know.
So I have a follow-up. Oh, sorry. It might be a little bit of a delay here. So I have a follow-up question. So it sounds like I need to look at my office's policy, maybe my department or agency's policy, to see who the first person I make the request to is. And maybe there's a relevant part of the policy that I can even cite in addition to the template to make my case even stronger for why my request should be granted. Do you have any advice, not legal advice, but for informational purposes only, do you have any suggestions, I should say, I guess, about whether I should make this initial request in writing, like over email, or is it sufficient to just go into my let's say the policy says I need to ask my supervisor. Would it be enough to just go in my supervisor's office one day and verbally say, hey, this is the request that I have. What do you think? That sort of thing. Does it make a difference whether it's orally or in writing? Is there a preferred method?
Title VII doesn't require the request to be made in writing. However, to at least preserve the record, you probably want to make that request in writing just so that everybody's clear. There's no dispute as to what you requested. They can't say that they didn't get it, because you'll have a copy, they'll have a copy. You will have shown that you've done what you needed to do. That's required under Title VII.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's also helpful for denial purposes. Like, let's say they deny them. And then you could ask, like, can you give me this? Oh, I think Chelsea's breaking up a little bit. But I think then you could ask, like, can you give me the specific reason in writing? You don't have to say in writing, because if it's on for email, you're going back and forth of why it's a substantial burden. Again, they have to make it not general, say, oh, we're just busy, but really specific ways that this poses a substantial burden, and document it, get it in writing. Something I would also say is maybe look to other Muslims that work in your area or previously worked, or other people that have sought religious accommodation. Have they been denied? Is this a pattern, or is it specifically to you? And if it's specifically to you, that's when we get to, like, murky waters, and you have other alternatives to seek as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's say I use the template, I submit my request, I submit it over email, I follow my company's policy, and then my supervisor emails me back and saying, whoa, 1 month, this is way too long for you to just be working from home. What should I do next? And so I know, Chelsea, you alluded to this earlier, that, okay, maybe they might say no to the initial request, but I think you mentioned that, especially also earlier in the presentation, that this is supposed to be an interactive process, where it's not just one request, one decision, and that's it. We're supposed to go back and forth. And so can you help walk me through, what does that back and forth look like? So let's say my initial request to just telework the entire month, they say no. How do you recommend I proceed further in to try to still get some accommodation if it's not, the whole month of telework?
Yes, I think you might also consider asking why they're denying it. Will they explain, what is the burden of it for one employee to have to telework during the month, if that's your preferred accommodation? I would definitely get that in writing as well, because that's going to be what they're going to cite in the future as the basis of their denial. And then that can also help you decide, offer a different alternative. If they say, we only have 3 people and we need everybody to be in the office to do XYZ, okay, maybe that creates a substantial burden. Then they offer a compromise. They might ask questions like, what what specifically do you need accommodated? Or is it rest time? Is it that you'll be awake earlier in the day and then more tired later in the day? Is it that you have to go to the mosque later in the day and therefore you want time to be able to get there? And so those kinds of conversations help both you and the employer figure out the best accommodation that works for both of you. That's basically what I would suggest. Follow up, just get an understanding of what they're claiming the burden is so that you can then present an accommodation that basically gives them no out. They can't say that you're still being burdensome if you say, well, I've addressed this issue, so I'm not sure why you can't. And remember, and then I always encourage people to cite Groff. Groff doesn't say the employer can or cannot deny accommodate. It says they must accommodate a religious need. So that is the position that you should always hold, is that the employer must accommodate your religious practice. They're not doing you a favor, they're following the law.
Thank you. And so what I'm hearing is that it would be helpful to clarify the why in both their end, why are they saying no, and what their concerns are, as well as for myself, knowing why I want the thing that I want, whether it's telework or something else, so that if they say no, I can be ready to say, well, if that doesn't work for you, and they explain why it doesn't work, I can offer an alternative that still gives me why I wanted the original request. And so now I have some other potential requests that I put on the screen. This is based both on the OPM guidance memo, as well as just sort of in general different accommodations that exist, similar to what the two of you explained earlier in the webinar. So, maybe not teleworking for the entire month, but teleworking in the early morning before coming into the office, after the fasting begins. Teleworking in the evening after breaking fast to make up for some hours that were lost potentially. Leaving the office early in the early afternoon and then finishing the day teleworking from home, especially, I know when like that 3 p.m. hits and I'm like, I need a break, get the blood flowing, come home, and then maybe working from home the rest of the day. This is actually something that I did when I was in the federal government, flexing the 30-minute lunch break in the middle of the day to the beginning or end of the day. And, it was really easy when I know this from personal experience, it's really easy to say to my supervisor, hey, I don't need a lunch break by definition. But I don't want to be working more than everybody else. I don't want to just work through it and not get that time credited back. So can I leave 30 minutes earlier than I might normally leave? And they were amenable to that in my case. There's also working extra hours outside of fasting hours to earn religious comp time, and then using that comp time during parts of the fasting day that you prefer, as well as working in the early morning or evening as part of a maxi flex schedule. So those are all different alternatives to just straight telework for the whole month. Chelsea and Jinan, do you have any thoughts on some of these other potential requests? Do any stick out to you as particular that might be particularly effective to ask for, or are there some of these that you might suggest staying away from or using as a last resort? What are your thoughts on some of these other alternatives?
I think these are all great alternatives. I know that these are alternatives that other employees have used in the private sector for their Ramadan period. I know, like leaving the office, or especially if this age where lots of people do remote work, telework is a very easy to accommodate accommodation. I love the example you have about, you have a designated lunch period, just moving that lunch period to some other time. Maxiflex is interesting. That's a term I had never heard before I saw the memo. So I think that's curious. But I also, like we said, if the employer has said, here is this guidance of other accommodations we provide to every other religion, there's no reason you can't cite to those as potential requests. And working extra hours, that's another thing that we've recommended to people in the private sector, where it's especially if you know when Ramadan is coming, and like you don't want to work full days anymore during that period. Start conversations ahead of time. That's also, I didn't mention that, but start conversations with your employer as early as possible so they're not surprised, and they can't claim that you're all of a sudden springing this burden on them. You've explained what you need and why you need it. So I don't think any of these would be off the table. Of course, your employer. Not every employer is always the most responsive, but again, like we said, remember, you have the law on your side. They must accommodate your religious practice. So
Yeah. And the only quick thing I'd add to that is just we mentioned this previously, but probably be aware that your employer doesn't know like the little like details of Ramadan, about how the time is constantly moving up, things like that. And by the end of, or even at the beginning of Ramadan, it's going to enter towards the end of the workday. So you might have to do a little, Islam 101, giving them the information that this is, really needed, and why. Again, that giving that why is going to be really important.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to add to that, something I often encountered is sometimes, to go along with what Jinan just said with Islam 101, when you say fasting, I think oftentimes people think of like intermittent fasting, where you're still drinking water or having a smoothie, and oftentimes I need to really emphasize, like, oh, no. I am abstaining from all food and all drink, to really emphasize that, like, it's not like as if, teleworking in the late afternoon is just sort of a luxury. It's like, no, my energy is going to be pretty low. I'm still going to be a productive employee, but it's going to be a little lower than usual. And so maybe that, gives more of a reason to say, hey, maybe I telework for the last couple hours of the workday, or whatever it is that I'm requesting. So I know it's 8:45 and we still have some questions in the chat, but I just want to go over really quickly some of these other rights that exist, not just for federal workers, but any employee in the workplace that's subject to Title VII, which is most people. I want to go over religious discrimination and retaliation just very quickly. So in a nutshell, religious discrimination is just treating any employee unfavorably or differently based on their actual or perceived religious beliefs, observance, and practices. And similarly, retaliating against them for making a religious accommodation request. Or, for example, harassing someone because of their religious beliefs or perceived religious beliefs. So we'll skip this as a poll question because we're running out of time. But for example, this would be an example of religious discrimination. A newly hired Muslim employee asks for an adjusted schedule so he can attend Jummah. Coworkers begin making jokes and comments to him based on stereotypes about Muslims. One day he finds graffiti on his locker calling him a terrorist. When he complains to his supervisor says everyone's entitled to their own opinions, and the supervisor does not address the incidents. The supervisor also does not address the request for an adjusted schedule. That is pretty textbook religious discrimination. Jinan or Chelsea, is there anything you want to quickly add about this hypothetical?
Yes, this is, like you said, textbook religious discrimination. It's a hostile work environment. The supervisor is not allowed to just let these things go on. It's also, they're denying your religious accommodation by just ignoring your request. That constitutes a denial. They're violating Title VII by doing that. And so, yes, this is discrimination in multiple ways.
And then the last hypothetical here, we'll skip this as a poll question because we're running out of time, but a transit bus system prohibits Muslim drivers from wearing hijabs with their uniforms and issues a disciplinary write-up each time a Muslim employee wore a hijab with her uniform, but they also allow drivers to wear non-religious headgear such as baseball caps without penalty. This is also textbook religious discrimination because they are allowing some people to wear head coverings like baseball caps, but they're not allowing the woman with the hijab to wear her head covering. And so it's treating people who are normally in the same position differently based on religious observance. Anything either of you want to quickly add to this example? Pretty straightforward.
We'll just save the time for the questions. Yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, really quickly, retaliation is basically if you are getting punished for doing something like making a religious accommodation request or filing a EEO complaint or a complaint with the EEOC or some other entity complaining about religious discrimination or any other kind of discrimination, race, gender, discrimination, and then getting punished as a result. That is retaliation. That is prohibited by federal law. And it can not only filing a complaint, being a witness, participating in an investigation, making any kind of request. That is all, getting punished for doing any of those things constitutes retaliation under federal law. Time limits, federal employees, this is really important. Sadly, in my time here on the Legal Advocacy Committee for MAPS, this is something that folks often don't know, and it often really hurts their ability to vindicate their rights. There's a very, very strict deadline in the federal sector of 45 days. This is extremely short. Normally, in the legal deadline for things is usually 3 years in a lot of cases for a lot of laws, but here in the federal sector, 45 days, you have 45 days only to contact an EEO counselor about any discrimination or retaliation you might experience. For those outside of the federal sector, you have at least 180 days. In most states, it's actually more than that. It's about 300 days to file a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. Those are the time limits. Hopefully that is not relevant information for you, but in case it ever is, those what the deadlines are. So now Q&A. I know we've had a bunch of questions in the chat.